Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for this conversation about offshore wind energy and what it could mean for North Carolina. I'm Adam Wagner, the climate change and environment reporter at the News and Observer. For this discussion, we have a prepared list of questions, including some submitted by readers. We will do our best to cover as many topics as possible before the end of this evening's conversation. To follow the News and Observer's environmental coverage, you can follow me on Twitter at by Adam Wagner, or by visiting www.newsobserver.com. If you're joining us on the website, thank you. You'll find links to our coverage of offshore wind on the story page. Offshore wind energy has long been a topic of interest in North Carolina, particularly in the state's coastal communities. A report from the National Renewable Energy Lab indicates that North Carolina has the most potential wind energy on the East Coast, and the State Department of Commerce says the industry could represent as much as a $100 billion opportunity. There is some uncertainty, though, including how the turbines will interact with coastal fishing and tourism economies. We'll touch on all of that tonight. I'm joined tonight by Catherine Collins, president of the Southeastern Wind Coalition, and Montravius King, the Clean Energy Campaign's director for the NC League of Conservation Voters. Both Catherine and Montravius are members of the Offshore Wind for North Carolina Coalition, which promotes the industry's potential. Thank you both for being here. To start, I'm interested in hearing more about how you both would describe the current landscape for offshore wind in North Carolina. Catherine, let's start with you.
Thanks, Adam, and thank you for having me. I am very excited to chat offshore wind, as usual. So I would start by calling the landscape exciting. We are in a place in North Carolina where I think folks are starting to hear more about offshore wind, certainly in the news. We are hearing more about it from in the realm of politics, and then from the perspective of developers and utilities. They are also talking about offshore wind. We've seen a lot of leadership from the governor's office over the last year and a half or so. We've had Executive Order 218, which puts offshore wind front and center. I'm happy to chat more about that later. We have the state of North Carolina joined what's called the Smart Power Memorandum of Understanding, which is an agreement between North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland, looking at how we can streamline offshore wind permitting, how we can share best practices, and maybe most importantly, how we can recruit the industry to the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast states. And then you mentioned offshore wind for North Carolina. This has been something that is particularly exciting for me and for the Southeastern Wind Coalition. And that is because offshore wind for North Carolina was brought about as a way to make sure that we were doing really meaningful coastal education outreach, that we were getting a variety of NGOs, over 10 different NGOs in the state, to come together to make sure that we were covering all bases when it comes to offshore wind. We've got environmental NGOs, we've got right-leaning NGOs, left-leaning NGOs, and a little bit of everything in between, a lot of energy folks. So that's been a really rewarding coalition, and excited to have Montravius here to chat about his perspective of that coalition as well. So with offshore wind for North Carolina really taking off, it's just been overall a very, it's again brought offshore wind to the forefront. And then there are two projects off the coast of North Carolina. We've got the Kitty Hawk, or I should say right now they're lease areas, not necessarily projects, but the Kitty Hawk wind energy area is off the northeast corner of the coast, and then soon to be leased the Wilmington West wind energy area off the southeast portion of North Carolina's coast. So a lot of opportunity right now.
Thank you for that, Catherine. And I know that you've been working with the Southeastern Wind Coalition since 2015. How have state and federal governments kind of shifted their approach to offshore wind over over that time, or even just over the last 5 or so years?
There's been a significant shift. So when I started, you mentioned 2015. When I started this role, a lot of people looked at me a little bit crazy, like, "Why are you doing this? Why are you spending your time on wind? There's no wind in North Carolina." Um, Fortunately, there are a number of folks who never gave up and who've been excited about wind for well over a decade. And I think wind is finally hitting its stride, especially offshore wind in the state. So, from a federal perspective, 5 years ago during the Trump administration, we saw a lot of wind energy leasing. So I'll refer often to BOEM, which is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. BOEM is the federal agency that's responsible for lease sales on the Outer Continental Shelf. That can be for wind, it can be for oil and gas, you name it, any kind of energy leasing. And so during the Trump administration, we saw a lot of lease sales, but that agency is also responsible for processing the permits to build. So when you lease a wind energy area as a developer, that only gives you the right to submit through a very lengthy permitting process the request to build a wind energy project. And so what we saw was a significant slowing of those permits and very few projects actually moving through the permitting process. Um, at the very end of the Trump administration, there were a number of states asking for a moratorium on oil and gas leasing off the Atlantic coast, primarily Florida, South Carolina, and then North Carolina. And with that, that request was granted to those states. But at the very last minute of that administration's tenure, it was determined that not only did that include oil and gas leasing, but also included a moratorium on wind sales, on wind leasing. So unfortunately, what that meant was we've got a 10-year moratorium for the issuance of any new lease areas. You can build on current lease areas that have been leased, but that moratorium will start, it will be effective July 1st, 2022. And so I'm sure we'll talk more about that moratorium and what that means, or I hope we do. But that moratorium is definitely has shaped a lot of where things are happening right now in the state. So from a state level, what's changed? Well, and I should also mention from the federal level, just the significant momentum. We've got 30 gigawatts of offshore wind, over 30 gigawatts of offshore wind along the Atlantic coast that have been promised, promoted, goals. It really just depends on the state and how they've laid that out. But that's a significant amount of wind. That said, we only have two operating projects, and they're both very small. There's been a lot of groundwork laid over the last decade, and especially over the last 5 years for a number of projects. And so I think we're going to see a lot of those come to fruition, given all of that hefty groundwork that we've seen taking place over the last 5 years. From a state level, again, a lot has changed, which is why we're talking about offshore wind now, and weren't necessarily talking about it 5 years ago. Not at this level. So at the state level, what we've seen is really moving from the being on the defense of wind. We had a wind moratorium, another moratorium. We had a moratorium within the North Carolina legislature primarily for land-based wind, but they did throw the word offshore wind in there. And then we had just a number of lawmakers that were really seem to be fighting against wind for, not necessarily valid reasons. And we've moved from that, where we are constantly defending wind, to actually a place where we are supporting wind. And that's been a real shift, and something that I think all advocates are looking forward to. And that's why we've been able to get to a place where we can start to talk about offshore wind. So we've done some polling in the state, and also seen this I don't know if we could necessarily call it a shift because the polling we've done hasn't been significant over time. But over the last year, what we've seen is that North Carolina voters overwhelmingly support offshore wind. And not only do they support the development of offshore wind, but they support the legislature enacting policies to get us there, because offshore wind does require some level of policy support. We've seen the state enter, I mentioned smart power, that MOU between Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina. There are other states that have talked about joining, want to join, but haven't necessarily gotten their governors there yet. And so I think it's significant that North Carolina was really part of was one of the architects of smart power, and really going to show how you can partner with states in the region to bring more offshore wind to the forefront. And then Governor Cooper's executive orders have really, again, not only elevated the conversation, but given us goals. So Governor Cooper signed an executive order, Order 218, and that order put 2.8 gigawatts of offshore wind development as a goal for the state by 2030. And then by 2050, 8 gigawatts off the coast of North Carolina. Again, it's not a mandate, but it's a goal, and it gives us something to work toward. And I think certainly in more recent conversations, just hearing folks, it is a nice way to kind of draw a line in the sand and say, okay, can we get there? This is what we're aiming for. And then House Bill 951. This is an energy bill that was passed within the past year, and House Bill 951 puts carbon reduction into requirement for the state's major operating utility, which is Duke Energy. Offshore wind really starts to make economic sense when you have carbon constraints. If you don't have carbon constraints, you would burn a lot of fossil fuels, generate with a lot of solar. But once you bring carbon constraints into the equation, you can only have so much solar on your grid. You can only have so much land-based wind and energy storage on your grid. You really need offshore wind to complement those other resources. Offshore wind is also a very stable resource. It generates, it's almost constantly blowing. The other advantage is that offshore wind is blowing in the summer afternoons and winter mornings, which are peak load periods for the state of North Carolina. So also really making it a phenomenal resource for the state. I'll pause there. I know I've chatted for a little while.
Thank you for all of that, Catherine. It's all pretty crucial information in this conversation. Montravius, I want to turn to you and ask sort of that first question that I had, which is just from your standpoint, what is the present landscape for offshore wind in North Carolina?
Well, first and foremost, Adam, thanks to you and the NNO for hosting this exciting forum. It's great to be up here with Catherine. We work together on the Offshore Wind for North Carolina Coalition, and I'm happy to be here to represent the North Carolina League of Conservation Voters. The current landscape, I think it's extremely promising at this point. I just got on board last year. I know a lot of has happened over the last 2 years, specifically in North Carolina, and most recently with the Biden administration moving more aggressively to meet its carbon emissions goals. But I definitely see, the landscape as being more competitive in terms of the cost. From my research, I think we can all see that the cost of operating offshore wind has definitely seen a decrease, and we're going to continue to see a decline in operation costs, especially as North Carolina uses its manufacturing and awesome transportation network. So there's some promising opportunities when it comes to offshore wind, and I think things are going to get better and better and better.
That all makes sense, Montravius. I want to stay with you for a second as we talk about climate change. Catherine mentioned House Bill 951, which set carbon reduction goals for the state's power sector by 2030. It makes a net zero target by 2050 state law. How do you see offshore wind fitting into those efforts to hit those targets?
Exactly. As Catherine mentioned not too long ago, Thanks to Governor Cooper's administration and his executive orders, which specifically target offshore wind, I think that that we have an amazing opportunity to generate electricity, clean electricity, and power millions of homes by, by using the resources that our state currently have in place. And by focusing on offshore wind, we can supplement what the resources that we already have, and basically, North Carolina is in a place where we basically have more wind potential than any other state on the Atlantic coast, and that's an amazing place to be in. And we want to harness that as much as possible. So this development, when we're talking about offshore wind, we're also looking at, reducing the carbon costs. And not only that, but also creating jobs and addressing and tackling climate change. So there's so many win-wins in this. And I think the important thing is to look at the big picture: carbon reduction, job creation, and tackling environmental justice and inequities.
Sure. And obviously there are potential environmental benefits, but jobs are also a big part of this. There was a report commissioned last year by the NC Department of Commerce that said North Carolina could see as much as $100 billion in benefits from offshore wind or from the offshore wind supply chain. Catherine, you mentioned some of this earlier, but how is North Carolina positioned to benefit from those gains, and how does that compare to other states in the region? Here, I'm obviously specifically kind of thinking about Virginia, which kind of shares that Kitty Hawk site.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it is one of the things that we talk about most frequently because it is so important. I mentioned we talk about why offshore wind. There are very clear environmental and climate benefits. There are also very clear economic development benefits. We call it a once in a generation opportunity. And that's because when we're thinking about over $100 billion of supply chain coming to the US. And the reason for that is because we don't have a supply chain that is currently in the US, right? These projects have been built in Asia, in Europe, and so that is where the components are manufactured. When you have a pipeline of 30 gigawatts, that signals to industry, hey, come here. We're ready, right? We're ready to start manufacturing these major components in the US so that we can then install them here. In terms of what benefits might North Carolina see? We actually just published an analysis, a cost benefit analysis, looking at offshore wind. What would the net benefit be? So this says, okay, you're going to pay a small cost premium for offshore wind. We look at a 2.8 gigawatt project, thanks to Governor Cooper's executive order. So a 2.8 gigawatt project in 2030 or by 2030. How much economic development do we actually get in the state? If North Carolina is able to secure kind of an average amount of in-state production of the components and materials, the labor, obviously, that would be used to construct these wind farms, North Carolina would see a $3.7 to $4.5 billion net economic benefit over the 30-year life of a project. That's significant. Again, we think about this within embedded in that number is 10,000 construction and manufacturing jobs for 3 years during the course of a build out of that project. 10,000 jobs for 3 years, and then almost over 900 jobs for operations and maintenance of a wind farm ongoing. 30 years of 900 jobs. This is why you see so many states rushing to recruit this industry. It is, when we're starting from scratch. So every state is kind of clamoring to say, hey, come build your towers here, come build your blades here, build your nacelles here. You asked about Virginia, or you commented on Virginia. It's a good one to comment on. They are just neighbors to the north. Virginia has been aggressively pursuing this industry for a while. They, in their most recent large energy legislation, they put 5.4 gigawatts of offshore wind in the public interest, which is telling their regulators, yes, you can approve this. 5.4 gigawatts of offshore wind. And they have the first announced offshore wind blade manufacturing facility that has been announced for construction in Hampton Roads by the manufacturer called Siemens Gamesa. There's only really three major offshore wind turbine manufacturers. So we're looking for components to come from each one of those to be constructed along in ports along the East Coast, and then to be able to install those. So North Carolina, we can take advantage of that significant opportunity by developers will always tell you, or manufacturers will always tell you, first and foremost, signal development. If a state signals development, you saw in Virginia, they are going to get manufacturing. Manufacturers want a site close to where they're going to install. But that's not the only way to recruit the industry, and it can also be done through more traditional forms of business recruitment. So the Department of Commerce, you mentioned, Adam, the study that they published that looked at what attributes, what businesses does North Carolina already have in place that we can leverage to expand those businesses, to make sure that those businesses can participate in the offshore industry as well. And there are a lot of them in the state. You'd be shocked. We often show maps of where wind development is and then where the manufacturing assets are. There are a significant number of manufacturing assets in North Carolina, and more to come if we play our cards right. Virginia, we've all got great ports. Virginia definitely has some significant port advantages with the Port of Hampton Roads, and I think it just means it's all that much. It's that much more important for North Carolina to really be making sure that we are doing everything we can to recruit these businesses. And the state has hired an assistant secretary for renewables within the Department of Commerce. They've been putting commerce resources toward offshore wind for a number of years, because of Governor Cooper's executive order. And there are a lot of folks within the Offshore Wind for North Carolina campaign and elsewhere that are really working to make sure that we show developers that North Carolina is a great place to not only develop offshore wind, but to manufacture the components that are going to be needed for this industry.
Yeah, I think that the last number that I saw was something like more than 80 companies that were part of that supply chain registry that Congress put together that have a presence in North Carolina.
Yep.
So there's obviously opportunity there. Montravius, you're from Eastern North Carolina. You're a former elected official in Elizabeth City. When we talk about the jobs that offshore wind brings, or could bring specifically, how do they benefit those places that places like Snow Hill, places like Elizabeth City?
Thank you for asking that question. As you mentioned, I am from Eastern North Carolina. I'm a proud product of Greene County and the Greene County school system. Grew up in and around Snow Hill. And as most of you know, I attended Elizabeth City State University, which is located in the eastern part of our state. And I too was going to mention the close proximity to Hampton Roads and that new blade facility, which is the first one in the United States, offshore wind blade facility. So there are so many possibilities in Eastern North Carolina. The infrastructure is there, and the opportunities are there. And in terms of job creation, I think that workforce development and education is definitely a piece of that conversation. In terms of jobs, there are so many different jobs that are going to be created with offshore wind development potential. Some are high engineering jobs, construction, of course, operations, and then ongoing maintenance. When people look at offshore wind, sometimes they just look at the final picture But those turbines require ongoing maintenance and operation. So there's thousands of jobs. The potential is there to create thousands and thousands of jobs. And I think the conversation must also include how will we make sure that people that have been impacted the worst by climate change have an opportunity to be able to take advantage of one of those high-paying jobs. And that goes again back to what I was saying at workforce development and education is going to be key in that, because Eastern North Carolina, and I'll just be blunt about it, Eastern North Carolina has been forgotten about in some aspects in terms of economic opportunities. But I really believe that during this season we're in, with the Cooper administration and with the Biden administration prioritizing Build Back Better, that Eastern North Carolina is definitely on the verge of an economic revolution, and offshore wind is going to be a major part of that. So I'm so excited about the opportunities. But it's just important that, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, that we be strategic about it and that we're intentional about it so that everyone that wants to benefit can benefit. That's one of our main goals here at the League of Conservation Voters, that everyone can benefit, because we saw so many jobs leave Eastern North Carolina. So many good, high-paying manufacturing jobs have left Eastern North Carolina, and there's been a void here for so long. And now we have an opportunity. We have a unique, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to fill that void with high-paying, clean energy union jobs. And so excited about it.
Travis, you mentioned you started getting into energy justice there a little bit, environmental justice. And earlier this year, Governor Cooper signed Executive Order 246, which promised to take steps towards an equitable transition and to begin to create that jobs pipeline. What more can the government and businesses in North Carolina do to guarantee that the economic benefits from this industry really are shared equitably across the state?
That's a great question, and I think it's important. I think we're having a lot of these conversations now, but it's important to engage not only stakeholders in this conversation, but developers to begin the conversations on what an equitable clean energy conversation looks like. Even within my organization, we have those conversations regularly, and it's imperative that all stakeholders, developers, policymakers, key influencers have that conversation on what it looks like. We have some amazing examples from New York and other northern states. We don't have to reinvent the wheel here. There's some amazing examples. For example, in New York, they have a law that requires that 35% of funds invested in clean energy benefit disadvantaged communities. That's a policy. That's a policy measure. And I'm sure that before that policy was implemented, the conversations were had so that people understand how it benefits everyone, not just a certain group. When things are equitable, it's a win-win. And that's my favorite word. That's my favorite term. It's going to benefit everyone. Maryland requires that key minority and women-owned businesses that procurement commitments from developers are serious and have good faith efforts to seek minority project investors. And I think that's also imperative, because when we're talking about this clean energy economy and what it looks like, it doesn't only consist of high-paying jobs, but it also consists of an entrepreneurship opportunities. And it should include an entrepreneurship opportunities for Black and brown people and women also. We must be intentional about it. It must be in our policies. We must engage developers early on, and the public also must be aware of its benefits.
Thank you for that answer, Montrevious. Catherine, obviously, we have two wind energy areas off North Carolina that are the subject of conversation right now. Could you sort of briefly describe where we stand with the area off of Kitty Hawk that has already been leased and the area that's pretty much off of Bald Head Island that's likely going to be leased this summer?
Yeah, an important question and many important distinctions, because when you don't follow this 24/7, it gets confusing very quickly. So the Kitty Hawk wind energy area is 122,000 acres. It was leased in 2017 to Avangrid Renewables. And a lot of North Carolinians are also familiar with Avangrid because they are the owners and operators of the only land-based wind farm also in Northeast North Carolina. So Avangrid got this lease from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in 2017. I mentioned for $9 million. I remember when we thought that was a lot. There are some leases in New York that are being leased as we speak. They may have stopped bidding for tonight, but those leases are already over. The one that's about the same size as Kitty Hawk is already, the last time I checked, was already at $800 million. So just for a little bit of perspective there in how rapidly this industry is gaining traction, how important the country and the states in North Carolina or in the U.S. are seeing offshore wind as a resource. It's been just exciting to watch that all day. So the next lease that we'll get to watch will be for the Wilmington East area. Another important distinction that the area it's called, BOEM defines it as Carolina Long Bay. So you'll sometimes hear that term. It contains two wind energy areas or two defined areas. There was Wilmington East and then Wilmington West. The Bureau decided not to lease Wilmington West. It is in right whale critical habitat. So there's still some confusion about, well, what if this might be kind of close to shore? That area is much closer to shore. Wilmington East is about 17 nautical miles off the coast of Bald Head. It's about 22 nautical miles from its nearest land, kind of North Carolina mainland. So it's much further offshore than Wilmington West. We talked a little bit about the moratorium, and that's really where the current status comes in. So because of the leasing moratorium, the state in numerous aspects asked the BOEM to please go ahead and fast track that lease. The area has been defined for years, for almost a decade, if not longer. So it was really not that the area itself was identified quickly, but that they said, let's go ahead and lease this before the moratorium comes into play. So that is set to be leased in May of this year, and will be leased to the highest bidder. So we'll see a bidding process there, and yeah, it should be very exciting.
When are we likely to actually see turbines off of the coast of North Carolina in either Kitty Hawk or Wilmington East?
Kitty Hawk could develop as early as 2027 timeframe. That project is much further in the development cycle. Obviously, the area was leased in 2017 compared to Wilmington East. Wilmington East is going to be up to the developer. Kind of the complicated trifecta of who's going to buy that power and what's going to happen there. So I would say we could see turbines off the coast of North Carolina as early as 2027. If the stars do not align, and the stars in this case would be the utility, the regulators, the legislators, and the citizens, we could be as far out as 2030, 2032. So somewhere in that time frame, still TBD.
TBD is an interesting place to be. That last question, just like this next one, were questions from our audience tonight. So thank you for sending those in. We really appreciate it. Mondrevious, I know that you are excited about offshore wind, obviously, but anytime a new industry comes in to a place like the North Carolina coast, there are questions. One of our audience members wanted to know, what are the most significant barriers for offshore wind in North Carolina?
That's a good question, and again, we appreciate the audience for submitting questions. I know a lot of you submitted questions tonight. There are a few, that I've been thinking of. And I think one, as Catherine mentioned earlier, this is no quick process. This is not a couple of months process. This is not this is a multi-year process. So when you think about barriers in terms of, how it's going to benefit everyone, and in terms of meeting our carbon emission goals, let's just start there, because there's so many different barriers. When you compare us in relation to, as Catherine mentioned earlier, Europe, European countries they already have a head start, right? It seems like we are behind in the game, and this process, because offshore wind is regulated by the federal government, by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. It involves it's a painstaking process at times that involves comments from stakeholders, local communities. It involves environmental assessments. We just went through another one with the Wilmington East project. So this is, it can be a lengthy it is a lengthy process right now. And, I think the state of North Carolina is moving more aggressively in meeting our carbon emissions goals. But, if we're actually going to meet it, and if we're actually going to get there to mitigate the worst impact of the climate crisis, hopefully so, right? So that's where we are in terms of carbon emissions. In terms of other challenges, I think is, making sure that all voices are heard. Sometimes things can get, lost when people don't have the right facts. So I think it's imperative that stakeholders and that people like Catherine and I and different environmental groups, that it's important that we have the right facts and that we're genuine and that we're honest. Because the fact of the matter is, there are some questions that we don't have the answers to right now. There are some questions, some things we're going to find out later in the process. And it's important to be honest with people, because that's what people expect. And lastly, I just think that, more people need to be involved in the process. I hear this all the time, and I'll just go ahead and put it out there. Our environmental justice community, they deserve a voice in this process as well. So engaging that community should also be a top priority. We need to make sure that all voices are heard when we're transitioning to this clean energy economy and prioritizing offshore wind development.
Thank you for that answer, Montrevious. Catherine, I know that the Southeastern Wind Coalition and Offshore Wind for North Carolina recently commissioned visualizations of Wilmington East and what it would look like from Bald Head and from some places on the coast. And I know that you went to Southport and discussed that with residents there and local officials. What did you learn from those conversations, and sort of what were your takeaways?
We learned a lot. That's going to be my first answer. Let's see. We learned a lot and had a lot of takeaways. I have about 4 pages of them, but I will not read through them for you all tonight, I promise. No, in summary, what we learned is that once people see the visualizations, and you can see them on our website, we've got the official report that was commissioned on the website. We've got visualizations of the Wilmington East wind energy area from Bald Head, Oak Island, and Holden Beach. You really have to want to see those turbines to see them. You got to be squinting. It's got to be a perfectly clear day, which doesn't happen very often. Winter has the clearest days. Summer has the most humidity. So in the summer, it's almost impossible to see them unless you get your binoculars out, maybe climb a few stories higher. Then you can probably try to get a glimpse of the turbines. So that was really the visual impact takeaway. In terms of our takeaways, what we learned was that visual impacts it's not most people's primary concern. The biggest questions we heard were really around the environment. What is this going to mean for marine life? What's this going to mean for fishing? We had a lot of questions from recreational fishers. Good news is you can fish right around the turbines. They provide an artificial reef. So answering those kinds of questions and concerns, and I think that gets back to Montrevis's point about coming with facts. People have a lot of preconceived notions about what offshore wind might look like, what it might feel like, what it might do to their view or their livelihood. And it's just important to be upfront and honest and say, yes, you could see these from on a very clear day from Bald Head Island. The rest of the coast, it's unlikely that you are going to see them again unless you get your binoculars out. But answering, trying to find the answers, right? There's so many questions. So finding the answers, getting those back to people, and really communicating in as open and honest a way as possible is really important. And because we don't have a developer yet for a leaseholder for the Wilmington East Wind Energy Area, it's groups like Offshore Wind for North Carolina that are trying to get out there and trying to be the givers of information until we have a developer who's going to have more of the scientific surveys of the particular area and that kind of detailed information.
Thank you for that, Catherine. Yeah, and some of those questions, offshore wind has certainly been a conversation since I moved to North Carolina in 2012. So it's taken a while to get answers to some of these questions. We're nearing the end of tonight's conversation. I'd like to end with a question for both of you. What is one thing about offshore wind that you wish people in North Carolina understood better? We started with Catherine earlier, so we will go to Montrevious first.
First of all, thank you again, Adam. And thank you to everyone that's watching tonight. I'm sure hopefully this has been an extremely informative opportunity. I think that one thing that I want people to know, that I wish people had better understood, is that this is not only an opportunity to reduce our carbon emissions goal. Yes, that's top priority, right? But I also want people to know that this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to improve the lives of thousands of people that have been left behind for far too long in our marginalized communities, especially Eastern North Carolina, where we've seen the impact of climate change the hardest. And so, when we're talking about clean energy and we're talking about offshore wind, and I said this earlier, and I definitely want to close out with it because I hope it sticks, is that offshore wind is a win-win. It's a win-win. Of course, there's going to be challenges. There's going to be bumps in the road, and that's with anything. However, I want everybody to know that as we transition, it's also an opportunity to improve the lives of people, not only with high-paying jobs, but also with an entrepreneurship opportunities. It's an opportunity to revolutionize our economy as a whole in this state. And this is an opportunity that everyone can participate in, no matter who you are. You don't have to have a position. You don't have to be a member of the Offshore Wind Coalition in order to participate in this transition. You can be an ordinary person, a teacher, a student. Everyone has a voice in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Montrevious. And Catherine,
that is a hard close to follow, Montrevious. I kind of wish that I could have gone first. I cannot, Montrevious, that's such a phenomenal answer. And I think probably the most important answer for what do people need to know. So thank you for that. And yes, I'll reiterate, thank you for having us tonight. And I hope everybody has enjoyed the conversation or the panel. The thing that the takeaway that I will leave everyone with is that getting offshore wind is not as a development for the state of North Carolina is not as simple as just having the utility want it, just having the legislature want it, just having coastal residents want it. You really have a very complicated system of needing support from regulators, legislators, and the utility. All of them need to be on board and moving toward offshore wind development for it to actually happen. So if we're going to see this, if we're going to see this 2027 timeframe, people need to be talking about it. People need to be asking for it. You need to talk to, make it known to your legislators that you support this. Make it known to your utility that you want clean energy and that you want offshore wind to be a part of that energy mix. And then there are loads of folks who work with the regulators, but it's a complicated trifecta to bring offshore wind to fruition. But for all of the reasons Montravius mentioned, it is so incredibly important that we do this and that we do it right.
Thank you, Catherine. That's all we have time for tonight. Thank you all so much for your time. This conversation has been informative for me, and I'm sure it has been for those watching as well. Don't forget, this video can be viewed on demand at the News and Observer's website, www.newsobserver.com. You can also find links to our recent coverage of offshore wind there and our ongoing coverage of this issue. Thank you, Catherine and Montravius, for taking the time to talk about this topic. Before we sign off for the night, thank you, Montravius. Before we sign off for the night, I just want to remind everyone to check out the News and Observer on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Have a good evening, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.